Well, every year when Advent comes around, it's always a great time to reflect on great old hymns like Hark the Herald Angels Sing or O Come, Emmanuel. And this Advent season, we have a wonderful opportunity, actually. Jillian and you have collaborated together on a new hymn. And I'm so excited because I've been watching Jillian just day in and day out work so hard and studying a number of chapters in Isaiah, listening to sermons, reading commentaries, getting into the languages. It's just really been cool to see how this has even enhanced the celebration of Advent in our own home, and we're hoping even through you guys collaborating on this hymn, just to really bless Woodlawn. And we'd love to, through this opportunity, tell them more of the behind the scenes, like how did you get to this point of writing this hymn? There's a lot of times a lot of layers sometimes of these things. We'd love to hear y'all's perspective and how you guys came together in writing this and your study of the text. So why don't you introduce the name of the song and just go ahead and walk through it for us and let us know your thoughts and how you came to the conclusions you did.
Well, let me say this first. Jillian, I don't know about you, but I get asked all the time, like what's your process? Like, how do you come up with what you're going to write on? Someone even just yesterday asked me that same question. So we've collaborated on, this will be our fifth hymn. The first one was just you were writing lyrics to a previous melody, and then beyond, and I just helped you kind of tweak that. Didn't have too big of a role in that. But then we did several after that. We've done 2 psalm settings, Psalm 33, Psalm 48, and those were both written for our, we preached through the Psalms in the summer. So both of those were helping to serve that purpose of partnering a song with the text that we were preaching through. And then we also did a fourth one, which is called When I'm Laid Low, more about situations and life trials. And we won't get into those specifics of the songs, but as we think about this one, I often get questions about what's the process, how do y'all come up with it, how do you collaborate, who does what, those kinds of things. A lot of people actually think that I do lyrics and you do music. But it's really quite the opposite, because I am just not a lyrically creative person. Now, I can analyze a lyric and I can tell you how bad it is or how good it is.
And you do.
Yeah.
You have.
But I'm terrible at creating lyrics. But I can do melody and those things. So that's kind of been my role. So I thought it would be good with this Advent hymn that we've just finished up, that we're going to introduce to the congregation this Sunday, to just use that as kind of an example of here's what the process is. So it might be best to start, Jillian. I don't know if it was you. I think it was you who had the idea of an Advent hymn. When did you start to think through that?
I will say, since we've started writing, which this is probably year 2 or maybe 3, which is amazing that it's been that long already, but it's still so short. But that's always kind of been an ideal. I would have loved to theoretically write an Advent or a Christmas hymn, but I think for the first time this summer, maybe June or July, I mentioned, hey, 2020, we should shoot for an Advent hymn. And you're like, let's do it this year. I said, okay, well, if it's summer, now is the time to begin prepping and studying. And so you were receptive of that. You were excited about that. So that was kind of the green light to start something. And I don't know if now you want to talk about the process of which text we selected, but that is at least what initiated it for this go round.
Yeah, so typically there's some kind of biblical text that's piqued our interest that we want to write about. Obviously with the Psalms, that makes sense. But even in this one, I think originally we knew Advent, so we knew Old Testament was going to be kind of the driving force of the hymn. And so we looked at Isaiah. There's so many prophecies in Isaiah about the incarnation of Christ. I think we originally were settled on, was it?
Isaiah 11, 1 through 10.
Right.
Is what,
And you were kind of thinking through the text. But then there's something that caused me to think, there's this connection with Isaiah 7, Isaiah 9, and Isaiah 11, perhaps. And in my mind, I was also thinking, I can't really recall. Surely there's something out there, but I can't really recall anything that progresses through those 3 passages to connect really an underlying theme here of sign, signal that we'll talk about later. But so we had a Zoom meeting one day. Travis and I met together, and then you were at home, 3 little kids. Running around the house,
sure.
Probably helped to do it that way. And so that's when I kind of proposed, hey, what if we pivot and use these 3 passages? And then we talked in that Zoom meeting about how these 3 passages, it's Isaiah 7, 10 through 14, Isaiah 9, 1 through 7, and then Isaiah 10, Isaiah 11, 1 through 10. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we end up walking away from that meeting saying we could do one stanza on Isaiah 7, one stanza on Isaiah 9, mm-hmm. and then get 2 stanzas out of Isaiah 11, mm-hmm. 1 through 5, and then 6 through 10. I think that's the right breakup there. So in that process, we figured that out, and then we kind of set ourselves loose to study the text, which I think is so important.
Absolutely.
A lot of people will just sit down with an instrument and just have some kind of idea in their head and just start singing, and they've really not done any preparation as far as studying or those things. And so I think that's one thing that's kind of unique about our writing, is that we probably spend as much time studying the scriptures that we're going to write about as we do actually writing the song. I would think. And then you, Travis, you're always a real help with this too, because as we're thinking through, in this one there were even some disagreements over some eschatological themes, and so we managed that to come out. One thing we can for sure say is that there's a future reign of Christ in mind, and regardless of which millennial understanding you take, we all affirm Christ will return. There is a future reign, and so that really dominates our last couple of stanzas as well. So all that to be said, we spent a lot of time just studying the scripture on our own before we came back together. And then once we were really confident in our understanding of the scripture, in a lot of ways you might call this like almost expository songwriting, because we're trying to think through the structure of the text, what's the main thrust of the text, so that the main thrust of the text can be the main thrust of our song, or each stanza. So in a lot of ways it's almost like expository songwriting, which I'm perhaps people are doing that, I don't know, but I like that. That's kind of our niche in a way. So once we got a good understanding of the text, this is kind of when, okay, Jillian, go find us some lyrics and then talk about that process.
I will say that my first song I wrote was in high school, but it was in no way scripturally based, and so I am so thankful to have learned that it's just not sufficient or even faithful to, as you mentioned, just sit down with an instrument and, okay, what comes to mind? Let me just make some rhymes. It's really as though God has given me a conviction that I just can't even sit and write or type until I have an understanding of the text that I want to write about. And so that really drives me to genuinely understand the text. And so I'm thankful for that. Sort of binds me in a way that I have to understand the text, and then it ends up being such a fruitful devotional process for me personally, even if no one were to ever hear these songs and I were just to share them with my family, or share them with you as a friend. Hopefully it would bless those that hear it, but even if not, like, it's such a blessing to me, this whole process. But I guess the practical logistics of it, when you and Travis and I kind of decided on the direction for the hymn, I began going to bed earlier for weeks and months while I'm writing, and I will wake up early, probably around 5:30, and I just have a couple hours before the boys wake up to study. I gather all of our Bible commentaries, and I have raided your library and Travis's and Pastor Lewis's, and I gather every possible resource that I have access to, and I try to exhaust and go through all of it. And when I feel like I can read through, and obviously reading through the actual pages of scripture multiple times, and when I feel like I actually have a handle, I may not understand it perfectly, of course, but when I feel like I have a handle of what God is trying to say, that's when I can sit down and write. And sometimes towards the end of that study process, maybe a theme will recur, or a phrase from a commentary will inspire me. Oh, that could be a really clarifying or helpful lyric, and so I'll jot it down. But primarily the first few weeks of writing lyrics is just gathering and learning, gleaning from the resources, and that is just such a thrilling, exciting part in and of itself. So,
do you guys ever sit and talk about things at home as you're studying?
For sure.
Oh yeah. She'll text me sometimes, and I remember sometimes if I get busy, she's like, "Hey, can you respond to the commentary or the comment I have about it?" I'm like, "Okay, yeah." And so, it's it was a really fun process to watch her learn and grow, and even like over some of those things like you mentioned, eschatology stuff. Like I would go listen to sermons of people who had different views and just kind of see, okay, how are they handling this text, and how are they preaching it, and so it was just really helpful for me, even just to nail down some things, but even just hearing how she processed it as well, and walking through the text, and even looking at, how is the New Testament using some of these texts as well. I mean, all of that was a very fruitful study and helpful to watch, go through the process too. So what did you guys name this hymn? What is the name of it? I don't think we mentioned it yet.
That's true. The name of this hymn is "Oh, Behold, God's People See the Sign." That is the first line of the hymn, but I think it also, and you can share your opinion, I think the idea of the sign encapsulates the theme of the hymn, right? So why don't you explain that? You're good at explaining that.
Yeah, this is helpful. If we look at Isaiah 7, verse 10, which is the beginning of the first stanza as well. It says, "Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. And he said," this being God, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin," here's the sign, "behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Well, while you've got the word sign in your minds, look over at 11, 1 through 10, served as stanzas 3 and 4 of the hymn. And then the verse 10 says this, "In the day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples." So that ties in really well with the word sign from earlier. "Of him shall the nations inquire." You can read nations here as Gentiles. "And his resting place shall be glorious." And so you see this connection here. God gave a sign in his son Emmanuel. And then that same son in his future reign shall be a signal to the nations. And so you have that binding theme there that really weaves its way in and out of the hymn. So Jillian, as you're writing lyrics, just from a practical thing, here's how we share. You start a Google Doc, and then you start with stanza 1. At this point, we don't know if we're gonna have a refrain or not. We're just usually we do, I guess, because usually we try to see, is there something in the text,
or that.
In a lot of ways, we even let the text of Scripture tell us whether or not we should have a refrain or not. And a lot of times, we end up with not having a refrain. So of our 4 hymns, I think 2 do have a refrain, and the last 2 have not. And so you'll start in the Google Doc, and then you'll footnote like crazy, which I really appreciate. Because I think does this have your footnotes that you've got here?
It does.
Yeah.
How many footnotes you got, Dearest, on that first page?
23.
23.
So 23 footnotes. So what Jillian does is she'll start writing the first stanza, and then she'll put a footnote after whatever word, after a word, and then the footnote is the reference to whatever verse in Scripture that she's drawing that from. And so then she'll end up with multiple footnotes even per verse of a stanza. By the way, you're thinking stanza as being, sometimes we call a stanza a verse, but really a stanza would be like the whole, what you sometimes call verse. And the verse is just each individual line within that stanza. So when I say verse, I really just mean like one phrase of lyrics with a few syllables. So that's in there as well. Jillian, one thing we didn't talk about earlier, when you're writing a lyric, are you just putting random words in there, or is there some kind of pattern to what you're writing?
Are you referring to the meter
anything like that?
Sure, yeah. You've been extremely helpful teaching me about what meter is, which is really the, I guess, skeleton of a hymn, or it undergirds a hymn, which is really helpful for consistency, which aids essentially in singability, which has been huge to learn and realize. But the meter may not be set initially. I think I could even have rough drafts of this stanza has this meter this one has this, and we kind of just figure out what works as it progresses. But yeah, it really is just, it's probably mostly led by, is there a word or a phrase that I want to maximize on or explain more about, and that's kind of what I build the stanza around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's several things like you're paying attention to as you're writing. So there's two types of meter. There's one where the meter is how many syllables are in each verse. And so this particular hymn is 9, 10, 9, 8, 10, 10. So if you pop open a hymnal, typically they'll have that meter at the bottom right corner, so you can see that. And that just says there are 9 syllables in this first verse, 10 syllables in the second verse, 9 in the third, 8 in the fourth, 10 in the fifth, and 10 in the sixth. So that's one type of meter. And the other type of meter is just even like syllabic emphasis. And so you typically will put that up above. You use like, what symbols do you typically use for that? So I know.
Isn't it an X for emphasized and then de-emphasized or unemphasized? It's like a backslash or something.
Yeah, so we got slashes and X's, so we know how. And that's helpful to me. So as I'm writing melody, I can see here's if it's supposed to be da, 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 or if it's supposed to be da 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 da, you know, so even those things are really important to him writing. Or sometimes it's da 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 da. Yeah, so you're looking, and then some, you know, there's a mix of these sometimes between verses, but that's really helpful in being consistent in that, even between stanzas when you're writing. There's so many things that go into it. It's not just sitting down and coming up with some, you know, words that sound good with your, you know, your guitar chords or whatever, you know. It's there's much more into it. How do you write the stanzas? Are you thinking about all 4 at a time, or what? In this case, we have 4. So.
Let's see. This one, you know, when we first started with the Google Doc, I think we kind of laid out the map for it. Each stanza with its scripture that it was going to be based on. And so that definitely helps me to think holistically in those cases. And really, it's just amazing to see as you study scripture just how it's all so interwoven. So there definitely is that, I guess, aerial view of where this is going, although it's not perfectly, I guess, combed out just yet. And so much of it just kind of just develops throughout the process in a way that's kind of hard to explain. But I would say that definitely a theme is the goal, at least per stanza. Does that answer your question?
Sure. And then you'll get a stanza written, and you'll say, "Hey, Laramie, I've finished the stanza. Go look at it."
Yeah, and usually I won't progress until, because especially with something like this hymn, it does build, right? There's the sign in Isaiah 7, and then Isaiah 11, we learn what the sign is, what it means. And so, especially with a hymn that progresses in a way similar to this, I don't move forward unless I get your feedback. So, no pressure.
Yeah. So you're sitting there waiting on me.
Yeah, exactly.
And I try to be as quick as I can.
Yeah, for sure.
So you'll give me the stanza, or you'll tell me to go look at the stanza in Google Doc, and then I'll give you feedback. What kind of feedback do I typically give you?
I think one of my favorite types of feedback is you'll challenge why I use a certain lyric, not like antagonistically, but you'll want me to thoughtfully consider, is this the truest word based on the text, or is it a better word? I remember our previous hymn we wrote, I wanted to use, I think, Yahweh, but maybe the Hebrew was actually Elohim, so it's kind of being maybe a little lazy, honestly. And so you checked me on that, and so you do that in different ways with the lyrics, and you definitely will point out when my like syllabic emphasis is not right. Sometimes I just get so many words in my head that I don't realize that I'm expecting people to sing in a way that is unnatural to how they would say it. And so that's always a good, but certainly you are the bumpers, you and Travis both are the bumpers to keeping it just really rooted in scripture. And I'm not saying these cliches that unfortunately have been ingrained in me and probably you growing up on CCM. So
You poor thing.
We're pitiful.
Yeah.
That's true. You know, sometimes, you know, there are little phrases that do get overused. I think of, you know, those like shining like the sun, that's just one of many. Roaring like a lion. Mm-hmm. Yes, all those things are true, but okay, time for, gotta move on.
Yeah, we can be a little more creative,
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I found it was pretty amazing how, at least studying this hymn, and it was like, at first it was like, well, let's look at just Isaiah 11, and it was just such a focus on that whole chapter. And then just diving in depth, you started to see, and just thinking about how we build the context of a hymn, and sort of what we talked about a second ago, but a little bit more. Why in your mind, as you were studying Isaiah 11, we were fixed on that, why did you think we needed to expand back, in your mind?
I think, actually, I was studying Isaiah 11, 1 through 10, and, there were some of those questions eschatologically, like, oh my gosh, is this, like, I don't know, post-mill, all-mill, I don't know which mill it is. So that's kind of what I was stuck on, but actually I think Laramie had already done his own research or whatever. He'd already looked into it enough and realized, actually maybe we'll back this up, and then that was almost like a relief for me. Having 7 and 9, Isaiah 7 and 9 in the picture are a little more clarifying. So that was something I think that he ended up bringing back up. Cool. But and it was clarifying and helpful.
One of the things that did, going back to 7, back to 9, it really allowed us to have both Advents in view as well.
Yes.
Christ's first Advent, which has already happened, 2,000 years ago, and then his second Advent, which I think is incredibly important for believers today. When we think of Advent, is not to have our minds necessarily fixed on the first Advent, though that does take up a big portion of what we're doing, but that should lead us to have this longing for the second Advent of Christ. And so I think this song, this hymn does that well by reflecting on the first Advent, causing us to await the second Advent as well. And I guess we haven't really talked at this point, like, what does each of those passages really communicate? But, the first one in Isaiah 7, the sign is actually a sign of judgment, right? So it's not, this is not, Ahaz is wanting to reject it. He's prideful. He's wanting to trust in man, and trusting man to provide salvation for him. And God's like, well, that's ridiculous. I'm going to send you a sign anyway. And the sign being Emmanuel, God is with us, the one in whom we ought to place our trust. And then when you fast forward to Isaiah 9, what do we see there? Travis, what do we have in Isaiah 9?
Yeah, when we look at Isaiah 9, it's a very well-known passage. This idea, it's subtitled in the ESV, "For to us a child is born," and it walks through. I won't read it all here, but it talks. If I go to verse 6, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, and on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." And so we see here, one is a very well-known prophecy, but how did this, would you say, shape, you in writing stanza on this?
As you're reading that, it just reminds me that Scripture is just inexhaustible. There's so much that could have been included that just couldn't, and that's a wonderful thing, because it means that we can just continue without end to write songs that proclaim God's truth and that glorify Him. So that's a great thing, but it's also, it's humbling because it leaves you feeling almost like it's just a feeble attempt at explaining such an amazing, magnificent God. But specifically, what I did pull from Isaiah 9 was really rooted in verse 2. I know Laramie and we kind of went back and forth on this. Laramie, what do you think about the content of stanza 2? And what was chosen to be emphasized in this stanza? Yeah,
so here's where I think the expository nature of our hymn writing is really freeing. You have so much in 9, 1 through 7, but we didn't have to pack every bit of 9, 1 through 7 into a stanza of a hymn. We had to make sure that we communicate the main idea, the big truth, if you will, from this passage. And so once we figured that out, then it was a matter of expanding on that within the stanza. So I think that's really freeing in a lot of ways. This actually does bring up. Is this the one where we have cursed wait? Okay,
Yeah.
I want to talk about this for a moment. So every once in a while, we'll have a bit of a
back and forth.
Yeah, a bit of a back and forth, and so sometimes we do disagree. Sometimes we. So some people say, "What do you do when you disagree? Are you just always like completely in agreement?" So how do we handle disagreements? Okay, so in this case, stanza 2 reads this way: "Lead us to the feast of Emmanuel, in the land where gladness is abounding. There you lift the cursed weight of sin. There its bind will find its loosening," and it goes on. But the cursed weight of sin. That lyric, I can't remember what was there at first, but I essentially said to whatever we had originally, I was like, I don't know, I'm not feeling that word. I don't think it's the right word for us. And then I suggested like 10 words, and she's like, no, I don't think any of those are the right word. And then so we just let it rest for a little bit and went on, because we knew that we just needed to find the right 2-syllable word. We knew that we either needed a 2-syllable word followed by weight, or we needed weighty, which takes care of the 2-syllable word, and then a 1-syllable word to follow weighty. So we let that rest for I don't know, a couple of weeks, it seems like, and then we came back to it and came up with some more ideas, and we were like, no, your idea it's not the right idea. You said not the right idea to mine as well. And so we were still kind of left at this, at a standstill. So for a long time, I feel like a month or more, we had the lyrics in our Google Doc and just had like 3 underlines because we knew we needed 3 syllables there. We ended up with cursed weight. We had all sorts of different, things in there. And I think one of them was the one that was there originally was, I felt like
it was
the word
just heavy.
Oh yeah,
right?
Heavy weight. And in my mind, I thought heavy is descriptive of what a weight is, but I wanted something that would describe the consequence of the weight. And then I thought also like heavy weight was almost in my mind a little redundant. Heavy weight, because obviously a weight, if it's weighting, it's heavy. And so I wanted to communicate its effect more than, and so that's where we just let that sit for a while. And finally, after a month, I think cursed was your suggestion at the end of the day. And I said, I like it. Let's go with that. Cursed weight, because the weight of sin is a curse on people. And so I thought that worked really well.
You were finally able to get the weight of this verse off of you.
Yes. The weight of the verse was lifted.
Finally.
I think you mentioned we went back and forth for a month. I think we were completely done with lyrics and we were working on melody, and Travis said, hey, did y'all make a decision yet? So even he knew that it was just this thing that was just ominously awaiting our decision. So
that's probably one thing that in our entire history of hymn writing was probably the one little word that took the longest.
Probably so.
Right.
Yeah.
But typically disagreements are, you'll give me a lyric and I'll be like, here's some things, and if you feel strongly about something, I'm like, well, okay, well, why do you feel strongly? And then you'll say, and I'll be like, okay, well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or I'll be like, yeah, I'm perhaps we should still keep looking. And then we usually are quick to settle anything.
Yeah.
It's always been really peaceable.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, glad we're all still friends,
Yeah. 5 hymns in, we're still friends.
Yeah. That's right.
And I can't recall if we've ever gotten to a place where we just never did agree, and then we just went with. Have we ever had any of those?
I don't think so. If we have, this would have been close.
Yeah.
But it wasn't
if we
were upset.
If we ever do
it
get
was
to that point,
yeah.
we'll just let Travis be the decider.
That's right. I'll be the.
And you'll get a songwriting credit.
That's
for
right.
that.
That's awesome.
That tiebreaker.
Nice. So that means I get to write the next one. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
So you have to take either the side of your wife,
okay,
or the side of one of your closest friends.
Yeah. Oof.
What is more?
That's really tough. Really tough to be on.
What's the bigger refuge there?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So.
Hey, it's really interesting. We've talked for a long time, but we haven't even talked about music, which
True.
I think is,
I was going to ask, yes.
But I was going to say that I think that's a really good thing, because it shows where we need to really put the most emphasis, and that's being
Very
faithful
nice.
to the biblical text.
Yeah.
Making sure that we come up with a beautiful lyric that fits, beautiful and rich. So its form matters as much as content. So we want to write really truthful, rich lyrics to that are truthful and faithful to Scripture, but we also want to write beautiful lyrics because form matters. It's kind of like this idea. If you ask me how I'm doing, let's say good. Or if you ask me how I'm doing, I say, I'm good. I just said the same word, but there's clearly different meaning in both of those. So form, carries meaning as well. And so we want to make sure we have a beautiful lyric. And then once all that's done, it's a matter of, kind of releasing it to me, I guess you will. And then I'll go to a piano and work on a melody. And then I usually struggle for a little bit. And then finally something clicks. And then I'll let it kind of rest for a few days or a week. And then go back to it. And then once I feel like I have something, this is where technology has been really helpful. So it's not always convenient for me to say, okay, Jillian, Travis, let's get together at the church and work on this melody. But what I can do at home with my piano is come up with something and pull up like a video messaging app and then send you guys a video message, and then you can listen to it. And then you can respond in the video message app and say, no, your melody is just awful. Don't know why you're using minor mode, all these types of things. But that's really helpful too, because then you can give feedback that way, and then I can listen to that and tweak some things. And then sometimes you suggested like moving the melody in a different direction at one point, because I was going to go do something like da da da, but I can't remember exactly. And then you said, what if we go? I'm just making up notes. I can't go off this, but da da da, walking down the melody that way. And then my first inclination was like, I think that might be, I don't know about that. But then after I sat with it, I was like, actually, that partners well with the melody in the fourth verse of the stanza. So that was the second verse of the stanza, which partnered well with the fourth. And so we finally, once we had agreed on a melody, at that point, then I'm taking it and fleshing out chords and things like that as well. But I really think it's important that when you're doing a melody, find a melody that can exist even apart from the chords beneath it. If you listen to so much modern music, if you were to remove rhythm and harmony and only have the melody, it would be awful. Like most modern music is just completely awful. So I really always try to strive for a melody that can exist on its own. I think that's a good sign of a melody. Not that we're, the best, lyric writers or melody. We still have a lot of growing to do. I feel like that. We're only 5 songs in, but in that way. But yeah, so I wanted something else stand alone, and then at that point, start building the chords underneath it.
I know something that I'm really so grateful to have learned as we partnered together on these hymns. I've learned just about the concept of singability and what aids in that and what hinders that. And I didn't know if you could remind me of a few of those principles as you're creating a melody that are in the back of your mind or in the forefront of your mind.
Sure. And so, Jillian, I'm guessing, like, when you first came to Woodlawn, your probably only experience musically was probably more contemporary Christian, right? And so then I think maybe some of your first, melodic suggestions were really syncopated, where, the melody is not falling on like a strong beat, those kinds of things. And not always necessarily moving in the most friendly direction. Or that I'm sometimes like repeating the same note, which is really common, and da 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 da. Not that you're doing that, but that's really common. And so it was just a matter of, I gave you a book called
that's right, The Anatomy of Hymnody.
The Anatomy of Hymnody, which is a really short, tiny book, which is really helpful. But that's I guess that's probably more helpful when it comes to like literary devices, those kinds of things. Think through meter. But with melody, trying to find something that leads in the right direction, that lands, the melody rhythmically lands in a helpful and friendly thing, and that just helps a body of people gather around it and to sing it. Otherwise it'll be a solo on Sunday mornings, which is what a lot of churches have. It's a performance. You've got a worship team up there, and they're singing, everybody's watching, and enjoying it. They're enjoying it, but they're not participating. And so that's really problematic. And so we always strive for something that's going to be inclusive of the congregation. And so some things.
Appreciate that. Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, in your mind, is there anything else you guys would want? Is it Woodlawn or whoever else watches this video? Is anything else just about the hymn, the process, the text, or even just the musical things like you were just mentioning, like from the Anatomy of Hymnody? Is there anything else like that you just kind of last minute comment of something you maybe forgot to mention that you think would benefit those listening?
I can't think of anything. We've we've probably given people that are watching this or listening to this,
plenty
to ponder and reflect on.
Yeah. Well, if you made it this far, then we'll definitely have some resources below of the things they mentioned. Links to those if you guys are interested for further consumption of this content, and ways that if you're a songwriter or if you have liked this kind of things, that you can also learn how to do this. And it's been a joy, just as a husband and as a father, to watch how Jillian has grown in this process, and how Laramie has even provided resources for her just to help her grow. And it's really cute for even some of our little kids to run around the house as she's working on a melody, and all of a sudden I hear them saying it. They're not even saying the words, but they're just like, saying the melody, and you're just like, oh wow, it's amazing how these things can shape lives and families, and it's a really precious thing to be able to witness that and firsthand. So yeah, it's a blessing. So thank you guys for your labor of love, just to shape God's people by having God-shaped hymns. I think that's a true blessing to the church, and will last for, Lord willing, generations to come.
Cool. Thanks.